When you wake up in a locked apartment and something's missing, you retrace your steps. You check the closet. You look under the bed. You tell yourself you're just forgetful. But when that missing object comes back on its own, damp, used, smelling like blood, you realize someone was inside your home while you slept, watching you, choosing what to take. This happened to Jerome Williams on Valentine's Day, 1996. His father's coat vanished from a locked apartment in Baltimore. No broken windows, no picked locks, gone by morning, back by night. And when it returned, there was a photograph in the pocket, a Polaroid of a man wearing Jerome's coat, face violently scratched away, sitting in a cinder block room Jerome had never seen. The police said it was a prank, but pranks don't leave bloodstains. Pranks don't leave strands of hair from an unidentified person. Pranks don't involve concrete dust that matches a specific storage facility connected to unsolved homicides from the 1970s. Jerome's coat was used for something during those missing hours, something that required a photograph, something that required blood. And when Jerome found the room from that photograph, a basement that had been locked for years, he realized his father had been there before, in 1989, logging evidence from cold cases that were never solved. One of those cases involved a man found dead in 1978, wearing someone else's coat, a coat that looked exactly like the one Jerome inherited. This is the story of what happened when the past refused to stay buried. If that gave you chills, smash that like button and subscribe, because what comes next is even stranger. Let's rewind to the moment Jerome's normal life ended. Jerome Williams was 29 years old in February of 1996, working as a claims adjuster for a mid-sized insurance firm in downtown Baltimore. He'd lived in the same Fells Point apartment for nearly 2 years, a modest one-bedroom with radiator heat, hardwood floors that creaked, and a view of the street below where row houses stood shoulder to shoulder like sentries. Jerome was methodical, quiet, the kind of man who kept his keys on the same hook, his shoes in the same spot, his routines locked in place like the deadbolt he turned every night before bed. His father had died in the spring of 1993, heart attack, at 56. Jerome had inherited almost nothing of value except the charcoal overcoat, a heavy, well-tailored piece his father wore to church and funerals. It smelled faintly of aftershave for months afterward. Jerome wore it through every winter since, not out of fashion, but out of memory. It was the kind of coat that made you stand a little straighter. February 14th started unremarkably. Jerome's alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. He showered, dressed, made instant coffee in a chipped mug. He reached for the coat by the door around 7:15, the way he did every weekday morning. His hand touched empty air. He blinked, looked again. The brass hook was bare. His lighter spring jacket still hung beside it. His scarf dangled from the hook above, but the overcoat was gone. Jerome stood there longer than he should have, staring at the space where the coat belonged, trying to rewind his memory. Had he left it at work? No, he distinctly remembered hanging it up the night before when he came home around 6 p.m. Had he taken it to the cleaners? He hadn't. He checked the closet, the bathroom, under his bed. The coat wasn't anywhere. He checked the door, deadbolt still engaged, chain lock untouched. He moved to the windows, both locked from the inside, painted shut from years of old tenants. He checked his wallet, still on the counter, $23 inside. His watch, his keys, his work bag, everything was exactly where he'd left it. The only thing missing was the coat. Jerome felt a slow, creeping unease settle into his chest. It wasn't fear yet, just wrongness. The kind of feeling you get when you find a door open that you know you closed. He left for work 10 minutes late, wearing the spring jacket, telling himself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he'd loaned it to someone and forgotten. Maybe he'd had a few drinks and misplaced it. Except Jerome didn't drink much. And he didn't forget things. At the office, he was distracted. He sat through meetings, barely listening, scrolling mentally through the previous evening. He'd made spaghetti, watched Seinfeld, read 20 pages of a Tom Clancy novel, hung up his coat, locked the door, went to bed. It was all there, unbroken, routine. But the coat wasn't. By the time he returned home that evening, the confusion had fermented into something closer to dread. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and froze. The coat was hanging on the hook by the door, exactly where it should have been, as if it had never left. Jerome didn't move for several seconds. He just stared at the coat, his keys still in his hand, the door half open behind him. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. Had he been mistaken this morning? Had he somehow overlooked it in his rush? But no, he'd searched. He'd checked that hook 3 times. The coat had not been there, and now it was back. Damp, cold, smelling of something he couldn't name, something that told him the impossible had happened. Someone had been inside his locked apartment, twice. Jerome approached the coat slowly, the way you'd approach something that might vanish if you moved too quickly. Up close, it looked like his coat. Same buttons, same stitching, same worn patch near the right cuff where his watch had rubbed the fabric thin over years of wear. He reached out and touched it. The wool was damp, not soaking, but cold and slightly wet, as if it had been left outside in mist or fog. Except it hadn't rained in Baltimore for 4 days. The forecast had been clear all week. Jerome lifted the coat off the hook and brought it to his face. The smell hit him immediately. Sharp, mineral, vaguely chemical. Not aftershave, not his father's scent. Something industrial, like wet concrete or iron filings. It made his sinuses sting slightly. He held the coat at arm's length and examined it under the overhead light. The fabric looked intact, no tears, no obvious stains on the exterior. But something was different. Something had happened to it. His heartbeat quickened. He checked the pockets. The right pocket was empty. The left pocket held something stiff. He pulled it out carefully. A Polaroid photograph. The image was dim, underexposed, but clear enough to make out details. It showed a small, bare room. Cinder block walls painted institutional beige. A single metal folding chair in the center, facing the camera. And sitting in that chair, wearing Jerome's coat, was a man. Or the shape of a man. His face had been scratched away, physically scratched, deep enough to scrape away the photo's emulsion, leaving only white scarring across where features should have been. Jerome's hand started to shake. He flipped the photo over. Nothing. No writing. No date stamp. No clue. He looked back at the coat, then at his apartment door. Still locked. Still chained. No signs of forced entry. No open windows. Nothing disturbed. Someone had taken his coat, used it, photographed someone, or something, wearing it, and returned it. All without leaving a trace. He called the police at 11:47 p.m. The officer who answered sounded bored, typing slowly in the background. Jerome tried to explain. The coat was missing this morning, now it's back tonight. There's a photograph of someone wearing it. It doesn't make sense. The officer asked if anything was stolen. Jerome said no. The officer asked if he'd given anyone a key. Jerome said no. The officer suggested it might be a prank, maybe an ex-partner with a grudge. Jerome said he didn't have an ex-partner. The officer said someone would come by in the morning to take a report. No one came. Jerome didn't sleep that night. He sat on his couch with the coat draped over the armrest and the Polaroid on the coffee table in front of him, staring at the scratched-out face. Who was that? Where was that room? And why his coat? The questions looped endlessly, unanswerable. Around 4 a.m., he got up and examined the coat more closely under the kitchen light. That's when he noticed the knees. Both knees of the coat were smudged with fine gray dust, almost powdery, embedded into the fabric. He rubbed it between his fingers. Gritty, like concrete or drywall. He turned the coat inside out and checked the lining. The interior silk was wrinkled and slightly stained near the collar, a dark, rust-colored smear about the size of a quarter. Jerome's stomach dropped. He knew what dried blood looked like. And then, caught in a loose thread near the stain, he found it. A single strand of hair. It was dark brown, coarse, about 3 inches long. Not his. Jerome's hair was black and tightly curled. This hair was straight. Jerome put the coat down and backed away from it. His apartment suddenly felt smaller, colder. He double-checked every lock. He checked the windows again. Then he sat back down and waited for morning. Jerome went to the police station in person the next morning. He brought the coat, the photograph, and a timeline written on a legal pad in his careful handwriting. The officer at the front desk listened with thinning patience, glanced at the photo, glanced at the coat, and told Jerome to wait. 40 minutes later, a detective named Sergeant Raymond Carver came out to meet him. Carver was in his mid-50s, graying at the temples, with the expression of a man who'd seen enough nonsense to be skeptical of everything. He took Jerome into a small interview room with scuffed walls and had him explain it all again. Jerome laid it out carefully. The missing coat, the locked apartment, the reappearance, the photograph, the dust on the knees, the hair, and the bloodstain. Carver examined the photo under a desk lamp, turning it slowly in the light. You're saying someone broke into your apartment, took your coat, did something with it, then brought it back, without leaving any sign of entry? Yes, Jerome said. And you live alone? Yes. No roommate, no partner, no one with a key. No one. Carver set the photo down and leaned back in his chair. You ever sleepwalk, Mr. Williams? Jerome's jaw tightened. No. You sure? Sometimes people do things at night, don't remember. Stress, medication, alcohol. I don't drink. I don't take medication. I didn't do this. Carver studied him for a long moment, then sighed. All right. I'll file a report. We'll log the coat and photo as evidence if you want to leave them, and we'll look into it. But I'm going to be honest with you. Unless there's a clear crime here, there's not much we can do. No theft. No assault. No witnesses. It's just weird. It's more than weird, Jerome said quietly. Someone was in my apartment. Twice. Carver didn't respond to that. He took Jerome's contact information, gave him a case number, and told him they'd be in touch. Jerome left the station with the sinking realization that no one was going to help him. This was his problem to solve. He went to work, but couldn't focus. Colleagues asked if he was feeling all right. He said he was fine. At lunch, he sat alone in his car and stared at the copy of the photograph he'd made at a Kinko's that morning. The scratched-out face haunted him. Why remove the face? To protect the person's identity? Or because there was no face to begin with? That evening, Jerome did something he hadn't planned on. He went to his landlord's office and asked if anyone else had keys to his apartment. The landlord, a squat, irritable man named Gus Mallory, checked his records and said no. Only Jerome and the master key, which Gus kept in a locked drawer in his desk. Jerome asked if anyone had requested access recently. Gus said no. Jerome asked if the previous tenant had moved out cleanly. Gus squinted at him. Yeah, guy moved to Pittsburgh in September. Why? Just curious, Jerome said. He went back to his apartment and stood in the doorway for a long time before going inside. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. He checked the coat again, checked the photograph again. Then he did something impulsive. He took the coat to a dry cleaner on Eastern Avenue and asked if they could identify the dust on the knees. The woman behind the counter, an older Korean woman who'd run the shop for decades, examined it under bright light. Concrete dust, she said flatly. Maybe plaster. You do construction? No, Jerome said. Can you clean it? Yes, but this... She pointed to the collar stain. This is blood. You know that, yes? Jerome nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long time, then wrapped the coat carefully in plastic and handed him a ticket. 3 days. Jerome started losing sleep, not just from anxiety, but from obsession. He couldn't let it go. On the third night, he began documenting everything in a spiral notebook. He wrote down every detail he could remember: the texture of the dust, the smell of the coat, the exact appearance of the photograph. He sketched the room from memory, the chair, the angle of the walls, the light source that must have been behind the camera. He returned to the police station on day 5. Carver wasn't there, but another officer told Jerome the coat and photo had been logged and sent to the lab for analysis. No updates yet. Jerome asked how long it would take. The officer shrugged. Weeks, maybe. Depends on the backlog. Jerome couldn't wait weeks. He started calling local photo labs, asking if anyone had developed a Polaroid recently of a cinder block room. Most hung up on him. One told him Polaroids don't get developed. They're instant. Jerome felt stupid. He tried a different approach. He went to hardware stores and construction supply shops, asking if anyone recognized the type of dust he described. One manager suggested it sounded like standard Type 1 Portland cement. Another said it could be drywall compound. No one had real answers, just guesses. On day 8, Jerome got a call from Sergeant Carver. "Mr. Williams, we got results back on the hair. No match in any database. Bloodstain was too degraded to type conclusively. The photos got no fingerprints except yours. I'm sorry, but unless something else turns up, this case is going cold." Jerome asked if they could trace where the Polaroid film was sold. Carver said they'd tried. It was a common stock, available at every drugstore in the city. Jerome asked if they'd checked for similar incidents. Carver paused. "What do you mean?" "Other people, other missing items, other photos." Carver said he'd look into it and hung up. Jerome doubted he would. That night, Jerome did what he should have done from the beginning. He went through his father's belongings. The coat had been his father's. Maybe there was a connection he'd missed. He pulled out an old cardboard box from his closet. Letters, photos, his father's wallet, a watch that had stopped working years ago. He sifted through everything carefully. And at the bottom, beneath a stack of church bulletins, he found something that made his breath catch. A business card. Faded, creased, printed in old typewriter font. It read, "Chesapeake Conservation Services. Document Preservation and Cold Storage, Baltimore, MD on the back. In his father's handwriting, March 1989. Check intake logs. I'm reserved 4. Jerome stared at it. His father had never mentioned working with a preservation company. He'd been a postal supervisor his entire career, not an archivist. But here was a card, with a note, dated 7 years ago. Jerome's hands trembled as he turned the card over again. The front had an address, 1120 Guilford Avenue. He looked it up in the phone book. The building still existed. It was listed as a private storage facility. No website, no phone number listed, just an address. Jerome grabbed his jacket and left. It was nearly midnight, but he didn't care. He drove through the empty streets of Baltimore, the city a patchwork of streetlights and shadows. When he arrived at 1120 Guilford, he found a squat, 3-story brick building with no signage. The windows were dark. A chain-link fence surrounded a small parking lot. The gate was unlocked. Jerome got out of his car and approached the front entrance. The door was steel, windowless, locked tight. He knocked. No answer. He walked around the side of the building. There was a loading dock, rusted shut, and near the back, a single basement window, half covered by dead weeds. Jerome knelt down and peered inside. Through the filthy glass, Jerome could make out shapes in the dim light filtering from the street, rows of metal shelving, stacks of boxes covered in dust, a concrete floor, and in the far corner, barely visible, was a metal folding chair, the same type of chair from the photograph. His heart slammed against his ribs. This was the room, or one just like it. Jerome didn't break in that night. He wasn't that reckless. But he came back the next morning at 9 a.m. and knocked on the front door until someone answered. A man in his 60s with bifocals and a cardigan opened the door a crack. "We're not open to the public." "I'm looking for information," Jerome said, "about my father. He worked with your company in 1989. Edward Williams." The man's expression flickered, something between recognition and discomfort. He glanced behind Jerome, then stepped back. "Come in, quickly." Inside, the building was exactly what Jerome had glimpsed through the window. Rows of industrial shelving, boxes labeled with alphanumeric codes and dates. The air smelled of dust and old paper. The man led Jerome to a small office in the back and gestured to a chair. "My name is Leonard Ashford. I manage this facility. We handle preservation for private clients, legal firms, hospitals, research institutions. Sensitive material. Your father's name doesn't ring a bell, but if he had a card, he might have been involved in a project." "What kind of project?" Jerome asked. Ashford hesitated. "We had a contract in the late 80s with the city, storing evidence for cold cases, homicides, missing persons, unsolved crimes, things that couldn't be destroyed but had no active investigation." "Your father may have helped transfer materials from the post office. He worked for the Postal Service, didn't he?" Jerome nodded slowly. "What kind of evidence?" "Clothing, mostly. Personal effects, photographs, items connected to victims." Jerome felt his chest tighten. "What happened to it?" "Most was destroyed in the mid-90s when city funding was cut. Some was returned to families, but a few items..." Ashford trailed off, looking uneasy. "There were some items that couldn't be accounted for, missing from inventory." "When?" "February of 1996. Jerome's blood went cold. "What was missing?" Ashford stood and crossed to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a thin manila folder and flipped through it slowly. 3 boxes. Logged out for transport to the county archives. Never arrived at the destination. We assumed theft. But nothing was ever proven. The driver said he delivered them. The archives said they never received them. He glanced at Jerome. "Why are you asking about this?" Jerome pulled out the copy of the Polaroid and placed it on the desk. Ashford stared at it. His face went pale. "Where did you get this?" "Someone returned it to me, along with my father's coat, in February." Ashford sat down heavily. "That's room 4, downstairs, where we used to photograph intake items for our logging system. But we stopped using it in 1992 when we switched to digital records. No one's been down there in years." "Can I see it?" Jerome asked. Ashford didn't answer right away. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. They descended a narrow staircase to the basement. The air was colder down here, stale and motionless. Ashford unlocked a door at the end of a dim hallway and pushed it open. The room was small, cinder-block walls painted beige, a single metal chair in the center, exactly like the photograph, except now it was empty. Dust covered everything. Cobwebs hung in the corners. Jerome stepped inside. The chair was the same. The walls were the same. But there was no coat, no man, no answers. Just the room, waiting. He turned to Ashford. "Who would have had access to this room in February of this year?" Ashford shook his head slowly. "No one. The building's been mostly locked during renovations." Jerome never found out who returned his coat. The police closed the case after 6 weeks. No leads, no suspects, no explanations that made sense. The bloodstain on the collar was eventually typed O positive, the most common blood type in the population. The hair had no DNA match in any database. The Polaroid was dusted, analyzed, cataloged, and filed away in an evidence locker. Sergeant Carver told Jerome it was likely a prank by someone with knowledge of his father's work, maybe a former colleague, maybe someone with a grudge against the family. But Jerome didn't believe that. Because 2 weeks after his visit to Chesapeake Conservation Services, Leonard Ashford called him. He'd found something in the old intake logs while going through archived records. 3 names associated with the missing boxes from February 1996. All 3 were cold cases from the 1970s, unsolved homicides, victims whose evidence had been stored and forgotten in the basement of 1120 Guilford Avenue. One of them, a man named David Tremaine, had been found in an abandoned building in South Baltimore in March of 1978, wearing someone else's coat. The coat had never been identified. No family had claimed it. It had been logged, photographed for the case file, and stored at Chesapeake, until it went missing in 1996. Jerome asked Ashford if he still had the photograph from the original intake log. Ashford said he did. He faxed it to Jerome that afternoon. It was grainy, black and white, decades old, and poorly preserved, but it showed a man sitting in a metal chair in room 4, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat. The face wasn't scratched out. It was clear. The man was David Tremaine. And the coat he was wearing looked exactly like Jerome's father's coat. The same style, the same buttons, the same cut. Jerome sat in his apartment that night, holding both photographs side by side under the lamp. The one from 1978, the one from 1996, the same room, the same chair, the same coat across 18 years. He didn't understand how it was possible. He didn't understand who had orchestrated it or why. But he understood one thing. His father had been part of something, and whatever that something was, it hadn't ended when Edward Williams died in 1993. Jerome never wore the coat again. He kept it in a sealed plastic bag in the back of his closet, untouched and undisturbed. The photograph stayed in a drawer beside his father's business card. He moved out of the apartment 6 months later, changed jobs, changed cities eventually. But every February, when the cold came back and the air smelled like winter, he thought about that morning. The missing coat, the impossible return, the scratched-out face in the photograph. Some mysteries don't have answers. Some disappearances last only hours, but echo for years afterward. Jerome learned that the past doesn't stay buried. It gets returned, quietly, in the middle of the night, damp and smelling of concrete and old blood. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, it leaves a photograph behind, a message, a warning, or maybe just proof that something happened in a room you'll never fully understand. The coat is still in Jerome's possession. He's 58 now, living in Pennsylvania, working a quiet job far from Baltimore. He hasn't opened that plastic bag in decades, but he knows it's there, waiting. Just like it waited for his father, just like it might wait for someone else someday. Because some things don't disappear. They just change hands. They move through time in ways we can't explain, connecting the living and the dead through objects we think we own but never really do. And sometimes, on cold February mornings, they vanish for a few hours, just long enough to remind us that we're not alone in our locked apartments, that something is watching, waiting, wearing our coats in rooms we'll never see, until one night it decides to give them back.